I got to change my view here. Hold on. And I'm going to pull up some slides to get us started. Just because the nice part about coming to a talk like this is you get a little bit of behind the scenes information, and that's what you're going to get with these slides. So just give me 1 second. All right. Can everyone see? Yeah, a couple thumbs up. All right, great. So Florence Adler Swims Forever, for those of you who have not read the book, is the story of a family, a Jewish family in Atlantic City in 1934. Florence Adler is a 20-year-old champion swimmer. She comes home from college intent on swimming the English Channel by the end of the summer. And it's not giving much away to tell you that she drowns very early in the book while she's out on a training swim off the coast of Atlantic City. She has a mother and a father. She has an older sister, Fanny. And Fanny is pregnant and in the hospital on bed rest. She has lost a baby the previous summer. And, the pregnancy that she is currently carrying is deemed risky. So she's in the hospital on bed rest. And when her sister dies, the family makes the decision not to tell her that Florence is dead. They fear it will jeopardize the pregnancy. So the entire family, which includes Fanny's husband, and also she has a little girl who's 7 named Gussie, goes in on keeping this secret. And the secret kind of extends. We start the book in June of 1934. And everything kind of comes to a head in early August of that summer. So you're with the family for about 2 months. And there are also, in addition to the Adlers, we follow 2 other people in the book. A woman named Anna, who has come over from Germany. She's about Florence's age, and she's immigrated. And the family has helped sponsor her visa, which was, a common practice in that time. And she has only just kind of gotten to know Florence when Florence dies. And then the last person we follow is a man named Stuart, who is Florence's swim coach. And he's also a lifeguard with the Atlantic City Beach Patrol. So that's kind of the cast of characters and a little bit about the story. If you have read the story and if you got to the author's note at the end of the book, you may have been surprised to learn that the story is based on a true story that occurred in my family. About 90 years ago, my grandmother was a little girl on the beach in Atlantic City. That's where she lived. And she witnessed her Aunt Florence go out for a training swim. She was training to swim the English Channel, and witnessed her body be brought back up onto the shore. And that became one of my grandmother's earliest memories. She always said of that day that there were 2 things she remembered very clearly. She remembered the red bathing cap that her aunt had been wearing when she went out for the swim. And she remembered the sound of her grandmother's wails on the beach that day. I don't remember a time when I didn't know this story. It was a very kind of often told story in our family. And, as you can see, my grandmother, I'll get there in a second. First, I want to point out these photos really quickly. So all of these photos include my grandmother. We've got her, over on the far right in her little sailor cap. And then this photo in the middle, I love because it's got so many Atlantic City details from that era. There's, the carriage, the pram you can see in the background, their bathing suits, which are, of course, quite hysterical and very, of the time. And then the beach chairs behind them that are these quite elaborate contraptions. On the far left is my grandmother with her mother. So for anyone who's read the book, this is Fanny in the story. This is a picture that's kind of closer to the age she would have been when the drowning occurred. And the note that you see on the left is a note that my grandmother wrote to her mother in the hospital, after her mother, my great grandmother, had her baby. And so, this dearest mother, I am so happy that I have a little sister. I hope you and sister are fine. Love, Frances Katz. And this is a very beloved note that has remained in our family, all these years, and it hangs in the nursery of my niece, who's named for my grandmother. And one thing you'll note on this note is that it's written on her grandfather's stationery, and you can see northeast corner of Virginia and Atlantic Avenues, Atlantic City, New Jersey. So just really kind of a moment in time. And of course, as my great grandmother was receiving that note, she didn't know, what had happened to her sister. My grandparents grew up in Atlantic City. They continued to live there, for the rest of their childhoods. My grandmother is over here on the left, Frances Katz. If anyone is from Atlantic City and wants to play the name game, both my grandparents graduated from Atlantic City High School, class of 1941. My grandparents did not date in high school, but you can see that they each list the other person as their pet aversion, which I think is a good indication that things are going in the right direction, right? They did not date and marry until their mid-20s. And they ended up leaving Atlantic City and, settling elsewhere. When my mother was a little girl, and these are photos of my mother and her brother, when she was a little girl, she would travel to Atlantic City on vacation, and she would, had lots of wonderful memories of being on the boardwalk in the 50s and 60s. And, Atlantic City was kind of a vibrant detail in all of those memories. Both her grandmothers lived in the same apartment building in Atlantic City, so she could run back and forth down the hall to visit both grandmothers, which I just think is a charming little detail. And so I kind of continued to hear stories throughout, my childhood about the Atlantic City of both my grandmother's and my mother's day. By the time I was born, nobody lived in Atlantic City anymore. This is my grandmother, my mother, and me, all of us, the oldest girls in our family. And so I really didn't grow up with any experience in Atlantic City, except for the fact that, I would hear these stories that they told. So let's get back to this story of the drowning. The drowning was a story that I always heard growing up. I knew that there had been this woman in my family who had been training to swim the English Channel. That was always a very kind of important component of the story. And I knew she had died, that it had, of course, been sudden, and that the family had kept her death from my great grandmother. The women in my family, I think initially when I heard the story, I heard it from my mother. And my mother was very interested in the story. And I think, in my earliest years, I probably heard the story in reference to why I needed to be careful around the water, why I needed to wait the hour, after I ate lunch before I could swim. That was something we always had to do. And it wasn't until I got to be a teenager and really a young adult that I realized that the story, the reason that everyone was still telling the story so many years later, had more to do with my great grandmother's reaction to the death than the death itself. Of course, it was very tragic that Florence had died, but that had happened many years prior. The reason we were still telling this story was because the women in my family universally believed that Esther, this is the character name for my great grandmother. We're going to stick to character names in this talk. They universally believed that Esther had made the right decision in keeping this death a secret. And as I got older, I just questioned it. I wasn't really, to me, it felt so antithetical to, the ideas of kind of transparency and honesty that I had been raised with. And I think I began to see the ways in which we were continuing to replicate that decision over and over again in other things, other aspects of our family life that we, would keep from my grandparents, for instance, so that they wouldn't worry, or, this became the model. The decision Esther had made became the model by which we kind of decided what we were and weren't going to tell others in the family. And I think, partly I was at that age where, you always think you're right. I was young and coming of age, and I just identified with Fanny, my great grandmother, who would have been in the hospital bed. And I thought, gosh, what if she had wanted to know the truth about her sister? What if she'd wanted to be able to kind of mourn in what I call real time, right? And so this was just something that nagged at me for a long time. And as I got older and began writing more, I started to think about what it might look like to write this story down in some way, this situation in which you've got a family that is keeping something so big from another family member. In 2015, I went to the Bread Loaf Writers Conference in Vermont. And I don't know if anyone's familiar with that conference, but it's a lovely, idyllic, it's one of these things, like it's summer camp for grownups. You get to go for 10 days to this beautiful mountain and hear from incredible writers, as they talk about their craft. And I went with a creative nonfiction project, but I was lucky enough to be in a workshop with the writer Ann Hood, who writes nonfiction as well as fiction. And I had this idea just bouncing around in my head for, how could I take this story and fictionalize it? And I remember having a conversation with Ann Hood at Bread Loaf that was extremely valuable to me. I said, I'm thinking about doing this. I really want to tell the story from 7 different people's perspectives. Do you think I can do that? Like, can I have 7 people's perspectives in one book? How will it work? What do you think? And we spent about an hour talking about it. And afterwards she said, Rachel, like, this is what you need to be working on. Go write it. You can do whatever you want. She was the perfect person to chat with about this. And I just left the conference very inspired and kind of ready to take on this big job of writing my first novel. Of course, I had no idea where to begin. And so where I began was learning more about channel swimming and really trying to get a sense of what my great aunt was doing all those years ago, out in the open water, off the coast of Atlantic City. What was she doing? Why was she so inspired to do this kind of seemingly impossible thing? And it didn't take me long in my research to find Trudy Etterly. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Trudy Etterly's story, but she was the first woman to swim the English Channel. She was an American woman, and she was also the first person to get a ticker tape parade in New York City, which I find really fascinating. But Trudy Etterly tried to swim the English Channel in 1925. And I mentioned this in the book. She got tapped out by her coach. Most people at that time were swimming from France to England. That was deemed kind of the best way to do it. And one of the rules of channel swimming is you cannot be touched at any point. And so he touched her very close to the end of the swim, and it cost her the whole year's worth of training. And as a result, when she came back in 1926 to try again with a new coach, she was very loud. She went, after she had gotten tapped out in 25, she went to all the papers. She made a big stink out of it. She was, she was upset, and rightly so, right? And so because the swim had been so well covered in the papers, it didn't take me long to kind of put these pieces together and realize, oh my gosh, my great great aunt was graduating from high school in 1926. She loved swimming. She was, already a very competent swimmer. And here you've got the most famous female swimmer, of her time, of all time, maybe, who is, in the papers daily. The summer she went back to try to swim again in 1926, when she was successful. Journalists encamped with her. They were sending dispatches back daily, because one of the things with channel swimming is you never know when you're going to be able to do it. Any given day you're watching the tides and trying to figure it out. So that was just kind of the first puzzle piece for me that clicked into place, was, understanding a little bit more about who my great great aunt was, why she would have been so obsessed with channel swimming in the late 20s. Because while my story is set in 1934, the real drowning happened in 1929. So this was just a really lovely window into the book. And I was reading about Trudy Etterly long before I started writing, but it certainly helped me see where I was going. Another thing that was really helpful was all of the newspaper coverage of just kind of your average summer at the beach. These are some examples of articles that were easy to dig up in the New York Times and in other papers, just kind of documenting the risks that were inherent in being at the beach, that are still inherent at anytime we go to the beach. But we're even more stringent's the wrong word. They were more in your face in this era because so many fewer people could swim. So, 1934, Atlantic City has only recently removed, I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of this, but there used to be kind of cables that would run out into the water that people could hold on to as they went out into the waves, because you didn't want to get knocked over by a wave because you might not be able to get back up. There were very few people who could swim, particularly women. So this was just a very nice window into what the beaches of Atlantic City would have been like in this era, and how prevalent drownings would have been, or near drownings. And just gave me a better sense of the world of the Atlantic City Beach Patrol and all the rest of it. Another thing that was extremely helpful for me as I started to work was old guidebooks. And because my grandparents had grown up in Atlantic City, some of these have been in our family for now 150 years. So Atlantic City came online as a tourist destination in like the 1860s, 1870s. The railroad goes in, you can go from Philadelphia to Atlantic City for the day. And, immediately afterward, they need some sort of documentation of what there is to see and do in Atlantic City. And so these books start to be written. And they were wonderful, wonderful views for me into, Atlantic City in a really bygone era. Another thing that was super helpful when it comes to Atlantic City is postcards. I don't know that there is another destination in the United States that had so many postcards created about it in the era in which, I'm looking. Every hotel, produced postcards of the exterior, postcards, of the interior, restaurants, the piers. So many businesses produced these and would give them out often for free because they wanted people to write home and say, I'm having so much fun in Atlantic City. Won't you please come? But for me, as I was trying to envision what life was like for the Adler family, as kind of locals that are, very much working in and amongst this tourist trade, it was extremely helpful to be able to see all of these landmarks for myself and really understand, what it was that they were looking at. And even things that you would think would be hard to dig up, I could usually find. And an example of that is the postcard on the bottom left is the beach hospital tent. For anyone who's read the book, you know that after Florence's body is brought back up onto the beach, she's taken to a beach hospital tent. And that was a concept that I really didn't have a good sense of. I've been to the beach numbers of times, but not to beaches that had beach hospital tents. And trying to figure out how they were organized and how they were run was one of my challenges when I was writing that scene. And so to be able to find a postcard like this that really clearly documents what one looked like in that era was extremely helpful. This is another tool that I used as I was bringing Atlantic City to life. I printed a map, and a map from that era, and I put it on foam core. In fact, you can see it behind me. It still sits at my desk. But I would put pins in it for, where the hotels were, where the lifeguard stands were, where different restaurants were that I knew that my characters were going to be, visiting. But that way I always knew where they were walking. So if they were passing something, I knew which side the ocean was on. I knew what direction they were going. And for me, that really helped, considering it was an area that I wasn't very familiar with. And even if I was familiar with Atlantic City today, and I certainly did visit, so much has changed that, it was key to kind of have this documentation to better understand the Atlantic City of 1934. I did visit Atlantic City, and as many of you know, it is a radically different place than it was in the 30s. The cemetery where Florence is buried is still there in Egg Harbor, which is off island, and so I was able to pay tribute to her. And then this is a photograph of the beach at States Avenue, which is around where she drowned. So, certain things are the same. The beach is still there. The piers are still in roughly the same places. You can get a sense of, how the boardwalk wraps around the island, and how the boardwalk interplays with the inlet. And, there's some things that you're able to still capture by being there. But if you're looking for buildings, there are not many that are still in existence. The Knife and Fork Inn is one of them. So if anyone's ever had a nice meal at the Knife and Fork Inn, that it's still going strong. One of the things I did in Atlantic City was I did, as much archival research as I could. So the Atlantic City Public Library, of course, has all the old local papers, and I was able to find an article that documented Florence's drowning, which actually gave me a lot of incredible details about that day that had not been passed down through the family. Another thing that the public library had was the archives of the Atlantic City Beach Patrol, which were really fascinating. I was a lifeguard growing up, so it was fascinating to look through these very historic lifeguarding documents. But one of the things that they had were their old logbooks. And so I was actually able to find the logbook from the year that my great-great-aunt drowned. And so you can see in this photograph, I'm not sure whether she's listed as the one person drowned or the 3 people who died of heart failure, because it is thought that she probably did die of heart failure while she was out swimming. But either way, it was sobering to see her kind of included in this tally. And one of the things that the logbooks were very helpful with was helping me understand how the lifeguarding tents worked, and how the chairs worked, and where guards were. You see in this logbook, Hygeia, Virginia, South Carolina, Kentucky. They're listing the names of the streets where there are lifeguarding tents, but those changed year to year. So if you flip forward to 34, they were in different places. So that's the level of research that was happening for this book. And the picture on the bottom right hand side is one that I love to share, because it just documents how sometimes you find the answers to your questions in the strangest places. And it's why, even as a novelist, archival research is really so important. This was a photograph that I found in the Atlantic County Historical Society's hospital archives. They had archives for the Atlantic City Hospital. And one of the things that I had really been struggling with was trying to figure out where what the hours would have been at these hospitals, hospitals in this era, because I knew that, I couldn't have people popping in and out to visit Fanny at all hours of the day and night the way that we might today in a hospital. I knew they didn't have that kind of access, but I had a hard time figuring out exactly what kind of access they did have. And lo and behold, I find this photograph of these nurses graduating, and behind their shoulder is a plaque on the wall that lists clear as day the visiting hours for, and it breaks it down by private wards, public wards. So it was just a really, private rooms had different hours than private wards. So that was just a wonderful example of how archival research can kind of save you in a pinch. Two things that come up in the book that are just interesting to kind of put some visuals with if you have read the book already. The Dion Quintuplets are referenced in the book. And for those of you who are not familiar with the story of the Dion Quintuplets, it was a story I was already familiar with before I sat down to write the book. These 5 babies that were born naturally, of course, to a woman in Canada. And the girls actually went on to live like a really sad life. Their childhoods were dreadfully sad. They were kind of taken from their parents and put in a almost like an exhibit that the Canadian government ran. And there's even more to the story than that. But when I learned that they were born in May of 1934, as I am setting this story in 1934, it was perfect because I thought, oh, of course, I've got this woman in a hospital bed who's lost a baby the previous summer, is worried about this pregnancy. And of course she would be obsessed with this woman who has already, and this woman, when she had the 5 quintuplets, she already had 5 or 6 children at home. And so I just thought, oh, naturally Fanny would have been, completely obsessed with them. So that was like a fun detail, a fun historical detail to put in the book. Another one that makes it into the book is the Incubator Exhibits that were on the boardwalk in 1934. They were called the Infantorium. And there was an infantorium in Atlantic City, and there was also one in Coney Island. They were run by a guy named Dr. Cooney. Not sure if he was actually a doctor. I think court's still out on that one. But he immigrated over from Europe, and I think his druthers would have been to sell incubators to hospitals. He knew that the technology worked. He had exhibited it in Europe, and but really, American hospitals were not ready for these contraptions. We needed a complete paradigm shift before hospitals would sign on the dotted line for these. They needed to kind of know they worked, and they really needed to even understand that prematurity was something that they could combat. Like that, it wasn't clear that was even something that was worth fighting, because there was a school of thought that believed that premature babies, for them to be born prematurely, something must have been wrong with them to start out with. So lots going on. He can't sell these incubators. He sets up these sideshows off the boardwalk. You can pay 25 cents and go in and see babies in incubators. And, over the course of, 10 or 15 years, these babies were doing much, much better than the ones that were in hospitals or, born at home with no intervention. And everyone started to kind of take notice. So these also make an appearance in the book, and I always get a lot of questions on them. So I figured I'd give you a little scoop, behind the scenes scoop on that. Those are all the slides I have. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and come back to you all and see what questions we have.
Thank you, Rachel. Before we get to questions, we'll see if we have any in the chats yet. If you have a question, you can put it in the chat. We can unmute you if you'd like to ask it in person. That's fine too. I just want to make a couple comments that I was making some notes while you were speaking. First of all, for anyone who's has not been to the East Coast, the Jersey Shore is very different from, and the Atlantic Ocean is very different from the Pacific. It's much colder. and there's much more turbulence and much more serious problems with the water. The lifeguards are militant to this day. They take their jobs very, very seriously. They're extremely well trained. They're usually crew, rowers, swimmers, water polo players, but there are a lot of them are crew. They're like studs, women and men. We've gone to the lifeguard races that they have at the end of the summer many, many times, and each city has its own beach patrol, and they compete against one another. They're very friendly, but it's a friendly competition, but they compete very, very fiercely. They have whistles. If you are outside within 2 feet of the range of their lifeguard station, they're whistling to you to move back in. Their eyes are peeled constantly. I mean, they watch people like hawks. I've never seen anything like it ever. It's so different from the West Coast. You can just go into the water here and do anything you want, basically. But there, no, they police you very, very, very tightly. So I think that's just worthy of note, because you mentioned, the Atlantic City Beach Patrol.
Yeah. And in that era, a lot of guys would do it as kind of a full-time occupation. I mean, obviously you can't do it in the wintertime, but they would kind of build their whole lives around being able to be a member of the Atlantic City Beach Patrol. And so you got a retirement, there was a pension. It was
a big deal.
Yeah.
We became friendly with the guy that ran Vintner for years, and he was a coach at Penn during the year and ran the beach patrol all summer. And once he retired from Penn, he just did this full time down at the beach. Great guy, Stan. I can't remember his last name, but he's a great guy. The one thing that I wanted to ask you is, you said that Florence, and I wanted you to mention your youngest daughter's name is.
Yeah, my youngest daughter is named Florence. I couldn't squeeze it past my husband for my first daughter. Her name's Clementine, but yeah, the second daughter, I caught him while his guard was down, and I got Florence through.
I just thought that was really lovely when I read it. I was like, oh my gosh, her daughter's named Florence. That was lovely.
Yeah.
So you said that Florence drowned in 1929, and you set this book in 34. Was that to be able to bring in Anna? Do we really?
Yeah, that was one of the reasons. That the first reason was because when I initially sat down and started thinking about writing the book, I knew it would take place over the summer, but I thought perhaps I would end up going through like the High Holy Days, or I wasn't exactly sure when I would cut things off. And I didn't want to get into the stock market crash.
Good idea.
It's like how writers are going to avoid 2020 for the rest of time, because they're not going to want all their characters in math.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was me avoiding like writing an economic treatise. And so then as I was kind of casting about for a year that would be appropriate to set the book, I wanted to move forward in time enough to be able to bring Anna into the story. Anna's the one, for those of you who haven't read it, who comes over from Germany. And so I actually, it was a little bit of a trick, because I had to find a year that was where the Third Reich was already in power, and there would be reason to leave Germany. So of course it's got to come after 33. But then I couldn't go too far into the 30s, because once we start getting a bunch of U-boats and landmines in the channel, you can no longer channel swim. So there was a period of time in which, channel swimming was totally off.
That was your sweet spot, was 34.
34 was the sweet spot. Exactly. That's when it had to happen.
And I read somewhere that your, I don't know if it would be great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents actually did. Anna was, for those of you who haven't read the book yet, and if you haven't, please do. Anna was a young girl brought over. It was somebody that the grandfather or the father knew from Germany back before he immigrated years earlier, and he brought this woman's daughter over to get away from the Nazi regime. And I think I read somewhere where somebody in your family history, they actually did that. They brought people over. Yeah,
it was on my grandfather's side of the family. So this story takes place with my grandmother's side, but both were in Atlantic City, and my grandfather's side was German Jewish, and they had immigrated a little earlier. They were a little more well established, and they brought over some cousins that were quite distant cousins, before, this would be in the years before the Holocaust. And so my grandfather had memories of, in the late 30s, sharing a room with these cousins who would kind of come for a period of time. They were always men. And, they'd stay until they could kind of get their feet on the ground, and then they'd, move on. So that was one thing that, as I was writing the book, it felt like, if I was going to capture that period of time, then, that was something I wanted to pay tribute to as well.
Yeah, it was a really nice addition to the book, I thought. The book title, I'd like you to kind of where that came from, because it's magical, because it's so evocative of the metaphor of a young girl drowning and dying, and how she's going to swim forever in everyone's minds. So
Yeah.
how did you come up with that? And when did you come up with that?
So, and I want you guys to know, for those of you who haven't read the book, it's not as big a downer as it sounds.
No, it happens so early.
Like, I mean, there is a girl who dies in the book very early on, but there are a lot of really poignant, happy moments in the book too. So, anyway, just putting that out there. Florence Adler Swims Forever was a title that I came up with about halfway through the book. I guess when I was writing the scene, with Stuart and Anna and Gussie, in the candy shop, and they're trying to kind of indoctrinate, Gussie into this society so that she will not spill the beans to her mother, or to anyone else. Stuart is thinking about a notebook that Florence had when she was training to swim the English Channel, that was titled Florence Adler Swims the English Channel. And so, as he starts to think about what the society will be called, this idea of Florence Adler Swims Forever just comes to him. But for me, the title worked on so many levels, because of course, she also, and I mean, I think this is true for anyone who dies, they live on through our memories. And so in this book, while she is not in most of the book, the family, as they're keeping the secret and continuing onward, they are, recalling her, remembering her in everything they do. And that felt, right to me. I love the idea, the saying that people aren't forgotten until the last person says their name. And so that, for me, the fact that she kind of lives on through the book in that way worked. When I signed with my agent, I expected, you hear these stories. I mean, when you're a debut author, you have no idea what you're doing. And so I kept expecting someone to tell me that the name had to change, the title had to change. I had heard sometimes your agent will tell you it has to change, or sometimes it'll be your editor. But my agent loved it. He said, no, that's what we're going out with. We're going to keep it. And then when we sold it, my editor loved it. She kept it. So all along the way, everyone, loved the name, and it stuck. So.
I think it's a lovely title, and it's really evocative of what it is. And like you said, it's not the book. The book is really about the family, and it's a beautiful book about the character development of the family and how they deal with their grief and how they deal with their lives. We have given very little away of what's going on in the book, even through your discussion and everything. There's so much that goes on. But it's not a downer book, because the reader never gets to know Florence, because she
right. Yeah, it's always, I mean, that's the trick with this book, is that I wanted to tell this story, the specific story that had happened to my family. And the book is always, the story's always been an aftermath story. It's a story about what happens after something bad happens. And so I knew I was going to have to kind of front load this tragedy. And the big debate was like, does it happen on the page? Does it happen off the page? Do we start and she's already died, or, just how does that work? And so I decided that I really did want you to spend at least a few pages getting to know her, and hopefully falling in love with her a little bit, so that you understood what this family had lost. But it had to happen quickly, because the story is about something else. Yeah.
It's lovely. And it's interesting because, how everybody deals with it. And I think Esther, the mother, she was so torn. She's lost a daughter, and she has a daughter that she's afraid either she might lose, or her daughter might lose her baby. And so she's trying to straddle that fence of grief and what could be grief. I really felt for her, she had to be so strong. And at the end of the book, Anna says to her, "You'll feel so much better when you've told Fanny everything." And she said, "Or will I just feel like Florence is really gone?" And I thought, that was so telling to me, because I think she had pushed it down for so long. I think she was going to have to then face the reality of it.
That was one of my realizations as I was writing the book, because I write, the book is told from 7 points of view. So I walk with a lot of people at different points in the book, and writing the perspective of my great grandmother, who was, had suffered this tremendous loss and then was lying about it. One of the kind of unforeseen discoveries that I made along the way was this realization that there's some amount of comfort in a lie like that, right? Because if you're working hard to convince others that she is not gone, then you can in some ways fool yourself into kind of hanging on to that idea for a little bit longer.
Right. So we do have a question from Susie Cohen. She says, "Is the book available on Audible? And if so, who was the reader?"
Yes. So it's definitely on Audible. And actually there are 7 readers. So, they came to me before the book was published and said, we have this idea, since you have 7 points of view, we want to hire 7 actors. And, so that's what they did. So you will have lots of voices in your head, as you're listening.
That's unusual to have that many readers, isn't it?
I think it's kind of a new thing. Like, I think they're doing it more with these multiple point of view books. And I think it's easier now because so many of the actors are recording in their homes, they have little home studios. And so it's easier for them to each send in their parts as opposed to getting 7 actors all in a recording studio somewhere. So yeah. That's
cool. Molly asks, would this book be okay for teens?
Well, my teen read it. My son read it. He was he 15 at the time? I think so. He's 16 now. So he must have read it. He read it when it came out. And he was really funny. He read the whole thing. And he said afterwards, he goes, "Mom, he said something sweet, like his version of sweet. I mean, he's 16, "Oh, I really like it, Mom," or you're a good writer. He was like, "You use a lot of adjectives," or something. He had some comment that was off the wall, but then he was like, "But we got to talk about that sex scene." Like, he was not amused that he had just been kind of tricked into reading a sex scene his mother had written. So
well, it had to happen sometime.
Right, exactly. But other than that one sex scene, which really isn't,
it isn't really sex,
not sexy.
And how did your family receive, how did they feel about you writing about what was a very private family tragedy?
I think the reason I could get away with it was that it had happened so long ago. If it had even been one generation closer, I think it would have been hard or too much, but my grandmother, who's Gussie in the book, she died in the middle of me writing the book. She was 94. And she did know that I was working on the book before she died. But of course, she didn't know that it would end up being published by Simon & Schuster. She knew it was a Word document on my computer. And as supportive as grandmothers are of their granddaughters, I'm not sure that every grandmother, who is privy to a Word document believes it will one day become, a book in a bookstore. So she did know I was working on it before she died. But I think if it had been, her parents that were alive, that would have been very different. My mother was, I think, when I first told her that I was going to do this, she was like, "Huh? Like, what?" And I kept saying, "Mom," because I was writing and sharing bits of it in a writer's workshop. And so I would say, "Oh, it's going over really well. People are really liking it. They think there's a lot of drama and a lot of this and a lot of that." And she was just so confused about how I would have enough plot, because for her, it was so obvious that you should keep a secret like this. And I mean, all of the women in my family kind of believe this, that she wondered like, well, how are you going to do this? Because how will there be anyone who believes that there's gray area with any of it? And I was like, I don't, Mom, I don't know that everyone's on the same page as you on this. But she was really sweet when the book came out. She said it was hard for her to read when I gave her a Word document to read, early on before I'd even signed with an agent. And she, and I did try to, I was like, Mom, it's fiction. It's really fiction. Like, I did, I gave myself permission the whole time when I was writing the book to change whatever I wanted to change, or, I wanted it to be the best novel that it could be. And so when I gave it to her, I said, yes, it is based on the family story, but it is fiction. And she said it took her about 2/3 of the way through reading the book to forget that these characters were her family, because she kept waiting for them to do things that her family members would have done. And they never did what she expected them to do, so by the time she got 2/3 of the way through, she realized these are characters, and I have no idea how this book is going to end, because I don't know what these people would do in this situation.
And particularly, you had no Isaac in your family.
Right. I had no Isaac in the family. So Isaac, for those of you who don't know, is a Fanny's husband, and he's not quite on the up and up. So my mom was like, what did you do to my grandfather? So we worked long and hard on my author's note and making sure, I had her read it, because, I very clearly said, Isaac is not my great grandfather. And she read a copy and she said, I want you to word this more strongly, like really emphasize that her grandfather was a great guy.
Yeah. To just circle back to Molly for a minute, I think this book is okay for teens, don't you? Anybody over 15 or 16, because it's light on the, it's light on the tragedy and more on the character development and how people and how they deal with the grief, and the fact that they decided to keep this from Fanny, and how that implicates everyone. So I think it's okay, don't you?
Well, and I mean, I grew up before there were so many YA novels, and I just read everything that was on my mom's bookshelf, and I turned out okay. So I think, yeah, I do it.
Yeah. Okay. I don't want to. I don't want to take. I don't have any questions now, but I don't want to be.
There is another question, Dana.
Okay,
Susan wanted to know what Rachel's next book.
that was my last question.
Yeah.
Working on now.
So I'm working on something now. It is not a continuation of the Adler family. I do get asked that a lot. I'm actually leaving New Jersey. I'm also leaving the 20th century, as it turns out. We're going to 1811 Richmond, Virginia, which I live in Richmond, Virginia, just not in 1811. In 1811, there was a terrible theater fire that took place in Richmond. There was only one theater in town, and it was packed. It was the night after Christmas. And, everyone had kind of come in from the countryside to hang out in the big city. And a prop caught on fire. And at the end of the night, 72 people were dead. Most of them were women. And the kind of reverberations of this fire were felt all up and down the East Coast. I mean, we were a relatively young country at the time. The governor of Virginia died in the fire, senator, a number of people that were kind of recognizable, but also a lot of women. And so I'm exploring that. It's another aftermath story, but instead of looking at kind of a family's grief, I'm looking at an entire community's. And yeah, so that's what I'm working on right now.
And you'll work with Simon Schuster and the same editor, and
Yep.
Have you prepared a manuscript or anything, or are you just working on the?
I am working on the manuscript now. I'm hopefully done very soon.
Oh, good.
Knock on wood.
Title yet?
What?
You have a working title?
I don't want to share the title in case it changes, but yes, there is a title. Okay. Hopefully it'll live up to our high standards, right?
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, I really appreciate all your time today.